Hey guys, Tarke here, and today we're going to do a complete Filterblade tutorial with trickling water sounds in the background so people need to pee. And also, before we get into this, don't watch this, watch something of substance like Stuart Lee's stand-up bit about Margaret Thatcher and Scooby-Doo. So, the first thing you need to do is go on to Filterblade, because we're going to do everything in Filterblade. That's where we're going to be working everything out. The second thing you need to do is work out what build are you making your filter for, because I make my filters on a build by build basis, and it's also worth noting this is with SSF in mind, because that's what I play. So for this tutorial I'll be using Tarke as my base. Surprise, I know. But general rule of thumb, just very quickly, let's say you're playing a Blade Blast build. What I'd recommend doing is going on SSF Ritual or SSF Hardcore, look for the skill you want on PoE Ninja, and then just kind of like look at the sort of gear that people have equipped, look at the bases, kind of have a look at, like, is there common themes, are there common items that are showing up between them, and if you start to realize, if all the Inquisitors are going armor-based, or if all the Inquisitors are going, like, ES-based, maybe I want to start looking at ES bases. It's a lot easier if when you do look at this, you look at it with maybe a particular ascendancy in mind. So maybe you want to be like, okay, what are all the Hierophants wearing? Or what are all the Chieftains wearing? Or whatever. You kind of get the idea, right? So go on PoE, Ninja, search for your skill, maybe filter a little bit by ascendancy, and then just kind of look at the gear that people are wearing and see if you notice particular themes. And that's one way to go about it. The other way to go about working out what sort of gear you want can just be going on the wiki and just looking at the list of all the bases. So, for example, here we've got the bows, helmets, gloves, boots, body armors, and quivers. And you can actually then just like scroll through them and just see, like, okay, what do these different bases have? Is there anything that stands out? So with Tarke/Toxic Rain, the main things you'd want would be high attack speed, and then maybe a good implicit, so maybe like 10% movement speed, right? So with that in mind, you'd be like, okay, so if I wanted to be IDing bows, I'd want to be focusing on bows with the most attacks per second, and then maybe any bows with good implicits. Likewise for quivers, you'd scroll through them and see is there anything that stands out. The main thing for Tarke is arrows pierce an additional target, so penetrating quivers we'd want on our filter. And you kind of go through, if you're looking for armor-based stuff, you'd look for armor, and you see which one has the most armor on it. And you get the idea, right? So, you kind of, before you even start making the filter, have an idea of the kinds of items you're going to want to show. It also helps if you know your build, and maybe any particular div cards you might want, because the way that Filterblade handles div cards is on their economy worth, which in SSF isn't something you care about. So rather than loading one of my pre-made filters, we're gonna just make one from scratch. So if you go on Filterblade for the first time, you'll have just the default never sync stable. We get a choice of strictness. These are just like different colors, and then you can get some like presets based on like Zizzer and streamer sounds. Don't do that. Why would you do that? So we'll just go with regular strictness to start off, and we'll pick Velvet because that sounds interesting. So you get into customizing. If you want to see what stuff looks like, you can go to the simulate and be like, okay, so these are kind of like purpley colors. Interesting. Maybe we want blue because blue is a color, right? You get the idea, right? So let's just go back to Velvet. So now we go into customize. So I'm gonna not go through absolutely everything, but mostly just going through the things that I look for when it comes to SSF. So, vendor recipes, starting at the top. Starting off in a league, it can be kind of nice to show chromatic items, especially in like a league start scenario. Generally, I don't want to be picking up 2x2s, because they use up a lot of space for the inventory. I nearly always just hide the stuff. If I'm going to show it, I would maybe show stuff like wands, daggers, 1x4s. So if you want to, you could keep that shown there, but it's something you would turn off very quickly. GCPs, this is a very important one. You all regularly need GCPs for, well, qualitating up your gems, especially when you start trying to level up stuff like Empowers or Enlightens. So, it can be worth picking up gems. So what you can do, if we were to, by default, high tier, 20 quality will always show, then it's 14, and then from 1. So if you were like, I don't want to pick up anything which isn't at least 8, then anything with a quality of 8 or higher will drop. And if you didn't know, if you vendor a bunch of quality gems, you'll get GCPs back. So that's a good way to start. Chisel recipe isn't worth doing in my opinion, so let's just disable that. Glass blowers. Glass blower recipe can be pretty good. It's one of the things you'll probably turn off pretty quickly. But it can still be worth just showing 20% quality flasks. Because 20% quality flasks you can just vendor straight away for a glass blowers. And if a 20% quality quartz flask drops and you want a quartz flask in your build, then that can save you some hassle. But maybe this is the sort of thing in a league start I would keep enabled. Jeweler's Orb, very important. This is the main like bread and butter. This is the main important thing here. If you want to assign sounds and stuff, you can pick different sounds. You can, you know, change the size, and you can. I want it to be brown. You can see there, and I want the shape to be a star. Like you can mess around with stuff quite a lot, but for this, we're mostly just going to be focusing on what should you show on your filter, right? And then this is 6 socket plus 5 link. Can be nice, especially in an SSF, to be seeing random 5 links. So maybe you want to assign a certain sound to it and a certain visual. But yeah, you get the idea. So this is all stuff. That's generally how I would set up the vendor recipes. For lore weave unique rings, this is one of those things of, do you want to use a lore weave in your build? Yes, no. If no, disable. Done. Chancing bases. So this is just default, just powerful chancing bases. I would just remove all of that. And I would just think, is there any particularly unique you want in your build? And if you're like, but I'm not very good with the game, how would I evaluate what sort of uniques I'd want? That's when you go back to where I started this video, looking at PoE Ninja, seeing if there are common uniques, like, oh, everyone's wearing carcass jacks. Maybe you want to chance into a carcass jack. So if there's any particular uniques you want to go for, do that. When it comes to Corsair carry specifically, there aren't really any uniques I'd really want. For Toxic Rain, yeah, maybe a carcass jack could be something you could try and chance into. But generally, unless there's something specific I'm going for, I wouldn't show anything there. Now we get into currency. So this is something where you can mostly keep the top stuff. Like, basically everything above Chaos Orb you can kind of just keep by default. If there are particular things that you want higher priority on, like maybe you actually really value Divine Orbs in SSF because they can be a bit hard to come by, maybe you might want to bump that up, and you can just drag things up and down tiers, right? And each tier will, you can see, have a different priority, different sounds. You get the idea, right? So generally, I would just focus kind of on the bottom end down here, because this is the kind of stuff you're going to be wanting to turn off quite quickly. Wisdoms and Portal Scrolls, the sort of stuff you're going to want to turn off very quickly. I like to drag these into the same tier to start with, just because when you're first leveling, you're probably going to be picking this stuff up, and then later on you can just press hide and it's gone, right? It's bye-bye. I generally, when it comes to like the low tier currency, League start, I'll show everything, but then I'll very quickly disable pretty much everything down here. But I will keep Blacksmith Whetstones. Blacksmith Whetstones are very versatile because you can vendor them. And you're like, wow, Tarke, what an amazing idea, vendoring Whetstones. So if you didn't know,
what is it, Exile?
You can sell Whetstones for wisdoms. You can also trade Whetstones in for armor scraps. And generally, at some point, you're going to need armor scraps. At some point, you're going to need Whetstones. At some point, you're going to need wisdoms. At some point, you're going to need portals.
I'm watching.
It can be quite efficient. Another thing that people like to do sometimes is they do like to vendor their Perendus coins in for wisdom scrolls. Can be an idea. But generally, in SSF, keeping an idea of like what sort of currency can I just turn into other currency. It's the sort of thing that's actually worth knowing about. So generally, yeah, hide nearly everything except for blacksmiths. I used to keep transients on my filter a lot. I've now since hidden those, and I only really show blacksmiths early. And then if you want to be picking up shards, you can have those. If you don't want to pick up shards, turn them off. I also like to bump alterations up. Alterations are one of the most powerful crafting things. I actually think that by default, Never6 made them higher prior, but I kind of like put them up like into almost like chaos tier, just because I think alterations are lit. So yeah, you kind of go through, you get the idea. It's just of working out like, what do I want, what don't I want. This is for leveling specific stuff. You can have it so that anything under like a 65 zone will show and stuff like that. And then this is for higher stack size, so maybe you don't want to show individual wisdom scrolls but you would very happily pick up 5 wisdoms, right? It's quite common that with newer leagues, they will drop stacks of currency. So this is just one of those things of, like, maybe you don't want to pick up a chromatic, but you would pick up 10 chromatics, you know, and then you can tune this, and you just move the slider, right? You get the idea. So that's all pretty basic stuff. Unique items. So this is the kind of thing that you can spend quite a lot of time on. Generally, what I would mostly just worry about is anything that you particularly really need for your build, bump it up in priority, because again, what's important to you is very different to what its market price is. But if you are really committed and you really want to min-max your filter, I would actually recommend going through every single unique in the game, looking at their bases, and removing them from here. But that can be rather time consuming, so it's not something I'm going to do, because we could quite easily spend a long time doing that. And if you're like, but how do I do that? You would just Google PoE wiki list of unique helmets or list of unique bows, and you just work through. Likewise with div cards. So generally what I would recommend doing is working out any key div cards you might need and bumping them up. So for me, a note in the wind. You can just drag these up and down the tiers. You can also, I believe, just search for it. Yeah, you can just search for it. Boom. And if it will say it's here, but you just press yes, and then it'll automatically move up. So likewise, we'll put the porcupine up a tier. And we instantly move it up, and Imperial Elixir. So basically just work out what the core things are that you need. If you have the time, though, I would recommend going through and removing things. If you hover over, it will tell you what the result is. So here, Prismatic Jewel Corrupted. Generally, you can focus on mostly just the bottom ones down here. And it can be pretty safe to just kind of like instantly hide the cheap cards. But there's generally some good stuff in here for SSF. So yeah, look for what you want. Prioritize having the div cards that are very important to you on the highest tier. If you have the time, go through and then fine-tune this section a bit. Current league, so that's Ritual. So this would be mostly just one of those things of... Ritual isn't that good of an example for this, but using Heist as an example, maybe you only want to be seeing like the highest tier rogue stuff dropping, or you only want to see missions of certain eye level. But yeah, if you didn't care about this stuff, you can remove it. Expansion, Echoes of the Atlas, don't touch this, you want to be picking all this stuff up. If you want, you can just put crazy sounds all over it, but you can basically leave those alone. Getting into the crafting stuff, this is again when it's important to know the base knowledge. So, this will depend on how strict of a filter you want to make. Generally, for me, I tend to make my filters only for the current build I'm currently playing, and then maybe one build ahead. I am very much of the strip everything down. So, for example, in a video I recently made, I said I would much rather remove 90% of the filter by default, but show like 12 different glove bases because I needed a glove upgrade, then use the default filter and be picking up loads of random maces and swords and axes that I don't need. Does that make sense? So, for example, if you knew that you never needed a crystal belt, you could take crystal belts off your filter because it's just bloat, right? It's stuff you don't need to be picking up. Likewise, if you never want steel rings, but actually you would want high-level steel rings looking at the better mods, then maybe you disable everything but keep the high-tier ones enabled, right? You get the idea? And you can just go through, you know, each tier, and you just work your way down, adding and removing, adding, removing, adding, removing. So this common base thing, this is basically just like showing stuff of eye level 86, because you need 86 to get the best crafts. And you just go through removing, adding the stuff you want. Flasks, same deal. This is stuff you would turn off very quickly, but at league start, you're going to want to build up a small base of flasks. If you know that you will never need, for example, a diamond flask because you're not playing any crit builds, no point picking them up, turn it off, right? Likewise, if you only play armor builds, well then you don't need the evasion flask on, right? And you get the idea, just kind of go through, add, remove, add, remove. It's mostly just about knowing what to target. Jewels, you're going to want to be picking jewels up, you can kind of just leave this all at default. Enchanted items, I would recommend just leaving this stuff on. It can be quite fun in SSF randomly just pick up enchanted helmets and be like, oh, I got a like +1 cremation hat. I guess I'll play that now. And then you can do like additional stuff, but you get the idea, right? So in maps generally is set up pretty well by default, but if you were like, I only want to be picking up maps of a certain tier, or maybe there are specific maps that are more valuable to you, you might want to highlight them with special rules. Out-leveled maps, you can see they gray, they become less important if you're in a certain tier. So you might be like, look, if I'm doing like tier 60 maps, I never want to be picking up tier 1s, tier 5s, you can just hide it and they'll be disabled. Maps highlight mode, so highlight and hide specific maps. So for example, let's say that we really care about farming Imperial Legacies. We need Desert Springs, we need Dunes. So maybe we'd be like, okay, let's show, and let's put Desert in there, Desert Springs, and Dunes. So this is mostly if you're like trying to highlight specific maps for a particular div card, or maybe just because you like a particular layout, or you've got some weird Atlas strategy. That's where this would be important, right? Map fragments, you can mostly just kind of leave this by default, but if you wanted to really min-max it, maybe you really like running at Zeri, so maybe you might want to give Sacrifice at Midnight, which is the rarer one, give that prio, right? And you just go through Scarabs, leave by default. Prophecy, again, if you know there's like a particular prophecy that's very important to you, maybe you might want to like move it up a tier and just drag it, you know, up and down. If you know that you don't really care about low tier stuff, hide it, right? You get the idea. Tier 1, Tier 2 Handpick bases, so this is mostly where this is going to come in. So by default, it's going to just have all of this rubbish in there. So I would recommend, just to save yourself time, disable everything except for the smaller weapons, just because it's less clicking, and then in here add what you want. So we will now just do how I would do this for a Corsair build. So list of bows. I care about implicits, so I'm going to do Maraketh bows in terms of movement speed. I want to pick those up. Boom. And maybe if I was worrying about like attacks a second, I'd add thicket bows, maybe. But generally for me, I'd only ever show Maraketh. So that's that worried. So now we'll look through quivers. Are there any quivers you particularly want? As we said before, we want penetrating area quivers. Add that in there. And then let's go into the helmets. So are there any unique helmets which will take priority on the slot for my build? Nope. It's an evasion build, so really we care about the evasion bases, and I want the bases with the most evasion. So let's say it's a league start. Let's say that I haven't got a good hat. Well, in that case, I'm going to want a good hat as high priority. So I'm probably going to show the top 4 bases. And then once I get a good helmet, I can then shrink it down. So early on, I want to be picking up as many potential upgrades as possible, so I'll put all 4 on. And then once I've got a really good helmet, then maybe I'll only show the top 2. And if I've got an exceptionally good helmet, I'll then only show the top base, because it's still always possible to just get like a random 6 tier 1 item drop. So in this case, let's say we're doing the top 4. We would literally just copy it across, and you can also do this to make it a little bit easier for you. If you're like if you can't remember things, you're like, there you go. And you can just copy that across. So say Lion Pelt, Cinetricorn, and then do this all the way down to tier 4. I'm not going to do this for every single thing because it's adding time, adding bloat. And then I would go through again. I'll do the same thing with helmets. Sorry, same thing I did with helmets, with the gloves, with the boots, with the body armors. You can kind of see how this is kind of coming through, right? So once I've got that all set up the way I want it, I'm good to go. And then as I get upgrades, I'll just reload this and I'll just remove things from it. Tier 2 rares, this is just a thing of this will like just default show a bunch of stuff. I just disable all of this right away. I just go through, clicking disable and everything. Disable everything, we're done. Good to go. Rings and amulets. Generally, I like to just keep all rings and all amulets on by default. They're very small, they don't use up much inventory space. You'll randomly ID something insane, and you can always just vendor them for alterations. Same thing with belts. If you are trying to like really restrict everything and you don't need alterations, then yeah, you could get rid of stuff like chain belts, cloth belts, and studded belts because they're not that attractive, right? But generally, I'll just leave them on because it's still alterations at the end of the day. This is mostly for just random trash leveling stuff. Just go through, disable everything. Influence items, if there are specific things that you really need, add them in here. So if you're like, I really need penetrating arrow quivers with influence, add them to the highest tier, just as priority. And you can go through individually, you know, fine-tuning each thing if there's stuff you really don't care about. Likewise, when it comes to the league-specific stuff, if you're someone... A lot of people just aren't running Heist at all, so they might just want to turn that all off by default. I would recommend running Heist. One thing I would recommend doing, though, is in the Heist equipment thing, disable everything that isn't just the tier 1 bases, because generally the way that the rogue gear works is kind of like you'll eventually might just want to like half-arse craft some stuff with some alks, maybe a couple of chaos, but you only really care about doing that on the best bases. So maybe just have the best base on and remove everything else, just to limit the amount of random junk that you're filling up your stash with. Go through, do the same thing for each one. For example, with Legion, if you were really caring about particular splinters, you might want to move them up a tier, turn them down a tier. Particular incubators is, you know, stuff which give you 6 links and stuff like that. Highlight up. You go through. This is just leveling stuff. This is for under level 65. You can be lazy and just kind of keep everything on. But if you knew that, for example, you need particular colors, particular items, you could show, like, I'm going to show bows with 3 blue sockets, and you can do that all in here. Same with flasks, like, you know that, oh, I really need a particular flask early. You can show, disable, whatever. And then you kind of go through. Same thing with skill gems. If there are particular Val gems that you need a high priority, you can go through. Now, what you can do if you're like, okay, let's see if we actually set this up correctly. Let's just shove this on a level 85 zone. Generate loot. Right, so these are showing item level 85 bases. Okay, maybe you want to actually remove that stuff. You can control click, and it will take you straight to that section. Right, and you can add remove. So when in doubt, just hit the generator a couple of times, and if there's stuff in here like, oh, why is this showing up? Control click. Oh, we left that on by mistake. Whoops, disable. And you go through, and it's just because I didn't do this properly. I didn't like go through every single thing. You would go through every single thing, and yeah, you just test it. And then if you're like, okay, I think I've got everything set up right, but let me just check that my map stuff is set up correctly. You can spam generate on the maps and be like, yep, it's highlighting the correct maps I want it to highlight. Okay, cool. Once you've gone through everything, you've made it look the way you want it to, you then go through to the end and you can save it. You can save it to the website, you can link it to your account so it automatically goes to the game. I tend to be lazy. I will just save it, so we'll just be like, tutorial is swag, apply, and then I'll download it, and I'll show you how to install it. Tutorial is swag. Download, it downloads. You can then go show in folder. That will pop up. Copy. Documents. My games. Path of Exile. And where's paste? Paste. Then you go into PoE. Options. UI. Is it in here? Tutorial is swag. And it's loaded. And that's it. It's really that simple. Once you've done it once, you don't need to edit it all that much. If you use my approach of very targeted stuff, then yes, you can edit it more on a day-by-day basis. But you'll get to a point quite quickly if you just stick to 1 or 2 characters that you can just limit everything down to the smallest possible pool. And yeah, it's SSF. You need the game to be working with you, not against you. And I will just very quickly cover how I set up my stash to further help facilitate this, because I do think that the filter is half of it, the stash is the other half of it. Anything that is just remotely usable, so you'll see there'll be a lot of gear in it which just like has certain stats, has certain life, has certain influence, like your certain base. I'll just put in here. If you have more tabs, this works better. But yeah, bin 1 through 6. This is, I will just be collecting half usable gear, and they will just go in here. And then I will have my active one. Once one fills up, I then move it back. Once all of these are full, I will then go through and clean them up at some point. If you have more or less stash tabs, you can do this more or less. But generally for SSF, you're probably going to want at least 2 quad tabs. Maybe one which is just like good bases, good crafting bases. One which is stuff which may be usable. I then like to further break stuff down. So this is for my current build. This is my hybrid gear. This is for my toxic rain character. This is my lightning trap stuff. And I just like to compartmentalize everything. If you're chancing, maybe just have like a chance tab that you just dump everything in. Maybe likewise again, items of specific item level if you're trying to collect high item level bases. Put it in here. And yeah, you kind of get the idea. So hopefully that was helpful to someone. If you've got any more questions about this, if this raised more questions, let me know. If you'd like me to do a more follow-up, just leave a comment. I'm Tarke. Have a good day. Bye-bye.